In 1979, four young men vanished without a trace. They were Rising Storm, a pop band on the verge of stardom, driving through the mountain roads of Northern California after their final recording session. Their producer had just told them their debut album would change everything. Their families expected them home by midnight. They never arrived. But 22 years later, two experienced hikers discovered something deep in the remote wilderness that would unravel a mystery no one had been able to solve. What they found in that hidden ravine would reveal a truth so shocking that it would tear apart everything the families thought they knew about that terrible night in 1979. The discovery came on a crisp October morning in 2001 when Sarah Chen spotted something metallic glinting through the dense forest canopy. She and her hiking partner had been exploring an unmarked trail in the Shasta Trinity National Forest, following deer paths that seemed to lead nowhere. What they uncovered, buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and twisted undergrowth, was a 1978 Volkswagen bus, its psychedelic paint job faded, but still visible through the rust and decay. Inside, they found four sets of remains, still wearing the clothes that families remembered from police reports filed more than 2 decades earlier. But it was what else they discovered in that van that would launch an investigation, unlike anything the region had ever seen. Margaret Walsh had never stopped looking for her son. Danny Walsh, the lead guitarist of Rising Storm, had been 19 when he disappeared just 3 months before his 20th birthday. For 22 years, Margaret had carried his picture in her purse, shown it to truck drivers and gas station attendants, posted flyers in towns across 3 states. She had hired private investigators with money she didn't have, followed false leads that led to empty parking lots and disconnected phone numbers. When the call came from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department, Margaret was in her kitchen making the same breakfast she had prepared every morning since 1979, just in case Danny came home hungry. Deputy Rebecca Torres delivered the news with the careful precision of someone who had made too many of these calls. They had found the van, they had found the boys, but there were questions that needed answering. Margaret drove the 6 hours to the sheriff's station in a trance, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She had imagined this moment for more than 2 decades, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of finally knowing. Danny was gone. He had been gone all along, but now, for the first time since that October night in 1979, she might finally understand why Detective Ray Castellanos had worked missing persons cases for 15 years, but the Rising Storm disappearance had always haunted him. He had been a rookie deputy in 1979, one of dozens of officers who had combed the highways and back roads looking for any trace of the 4 young men. The case had gone cold within months, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved mysteries that accumulated in small-town police departments like sediment in still water. Now, staring at the evidence recovered from the van, Castellanos felt the familiar weight of unfinished business settling across his shoulders. The vehicle had been deliberately concealed, pushed deep into a ravine, and covered with branches and debris. This wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted the van to disappear, and they had succeeded for more than 20 years. The initial examination revealed details that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The van showed signs of a violent crash, but the damage patterns didn't match what investigators would expect from a vehicle that had simply driven off the winding mountain road. The front end was crushed, but not from impact with trees or rocks. The metal was bent inward as if something had struck the van, head-on with tremendous force. More troubling were the personal effects scattered throughout the vehicle. Wallets and jewelry remained untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. But the band's instruments were missing, along with a briefcase that Danny's mother remembered him carrying that night. According to Margaret Walsh, the briefcase contained contracts and demo recordings that their producer had given them after their final session. Castellanos began methodically retracing the events of October 15, 1979. Rising Storm had spent 3 days at Redwood Studios, a small recording facility outside of Eureka, working on what their producer, Vincent Hardwick, had promised would be their breakthrough album. The band consisted of Danny Walsh on guitar, Marcus Rivera on drums, Tony Brennan on bass, and Jimmy Chin, Sarah's brother, as the lead vocalist. The studio session had reportedly gone well. Hardwick, now retired and living in Oregon, recalled the energy in the room during those final recording days. The band had evolved from a group of teenagers playing covers at local clubs to seasoned musicians with their own sound, a blend of rock and pop that captured the restless energy of young people on the edge of the 80s. Their final song, a track called Highway Dreams, had been completed just hours before they packed up the van and began their journey home. Margaret Walsh met with Castellanos in a small conference room at the sheriff's station, bringing with her a cardboard box filled with everything she had collected about her son's disappearance over the past 22 years. Newspaper clippings, private investigator reports, photographs, letters from psychics and well-meaning strangers who claimed to have seen the band in cities across the country. It was the archive of a mother's obsession, organized with the desperate precision of someone who refused to let hope die. "Danny called me that night," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It was around 9:30. He said they were leaving the studio, that they'd be home by midnight. He was excited about the recording," said Vincent. "Thought they could get a record deal within 6 months." She pulled out a photograph of the 4 young men standing beside their van, taken just before they left for the studio. They looked impossibly young, their hair long and clothes carefully chosen to project the image of serious musicians. Danny stood in the center, his guitar case slung over his shoulder, grinning at something outside the frame of the photograph. "That was the last picture," Margaret continued. "Jimmy's mother took it. We were all so proud of them, so sure they were going to make it big." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, the weight of 22 years of wondering finally crashing down on her. Castellanos studied the photograph, noting details that might have seemed insignificant in 1979, but could prove crucial now. The van appeared to be in good condition, the tires properly inflated, no visible mechanical problems that might have caused them to break down. But it was the background of the photograph that caught his attention, a figure standing near a dark sedan parked across the street, partially obscured by shadows. "Do you remember who else was there that day?" Castellanos asked, pointing to the figure in the background. Margaret squinted at the photograph, then shook her head. "There were always people around when the boys were getting ready to leave. Neighbors, friends. I couldn't tell you who that might be." The detective made a note to have the photograph enhanced, though he wasn't optimistic about identifying someone from a 23-year-old snapshot. Still, in cold cases like this, the smallest details often prove to be the most important. The investigation took on new urgency when the coroner's preliminary report arrived 3 days later. The 4 young men had not died in a vehicle crash, as the damaged van might suggest. Instead, they had been killed by blunt force trauma, injuries consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The pattern of injuries suggested they had been attacked while standing outside the vehicle, possibly after being forced to stop. This revelation transformed the case from a tragic accident into a quadruple homicide, one that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. Castellanos assembled a task force of detectives from 3 counties, recognizing that the investigation would likely span a wide geographic area. The van had been found nearly 100 miles from the recording studio, in terrain so remote that it could have remained hidden for another 50 years if the hikers hadn't stumbled upon it. Vincent Hardwick proved to be a cooperative witness. When Castellanos and his partner, Detective Lisa Morrison, drove to Oregon to interview him. Now in his 70s, Hardwick lived in a modest home outside of Portland, surrounded by the memorabilia of a 4-decade career in the music industry. Gold records lined the walls of his home studio, alongside photographs of the hundreds of musicians who had recorded at Redwood Studios during its peak years in the 70s and 80s. Rising Storm was special, Hardwick said, settling into a worn leather chair in his living room. I'd worked with a lot of young bands, but these boys had something different. They weren't just playing music, they were living it. Every song came from somewhere real. He described the final recording session in detail, emphasizing how excited the band had been about their prospects. A major label had expressed interest in their demo recordings, and Hardwick had been negotiating a potential contract that could have launched their careers. The briefcase Danny had been carrying contained copies of these preliminary agreements, along with master recordings of their best songs. That briefcase was worth more than money to those boys, Hardwick explained. It represented everything they'd worked for, their entire future. Danny guarded it like it contained the crown jewels, but it was Hardwick's description of the days leading up to the recording session that caught Castellanos' attention. The producer mentioned several phone calls to the studio from someone claiming to represent a major record label, asking detailed questions about Rising Storm's recording, schedule, and travel plans. At the time, Hardwick had assumed these were legitimate industry inquiries, but in retrospect, the questions seemed unusually specific. The caller wanted to know exactly when they'd be leaving, what route they planned to take home, Hardwick recalled. I thought it was odd, but in those days, record companies sometimes sent representatives to unexpected places. I didn't think much of it until now. Hardwick provided the detectives with copies of all the master recordings from that final session, including Highway Dreams, the last song Rising Storm had ever recorded. Listening to the track in his car afterward, Castellanos was struck by the poignancy of Danny Walsh's guitar work, the way his solos seemed to soar above the rest of the band with an optimism that made their fate even more tragic. The investigation gained momentum when Morrison discovered a police report filed in Humboldt County just 2 days after Rising Storm's disappearance. A witness had reported seeing a dark sedan following a Volkswagen van on Highway 101 south of Eureka around 11 o'clock on the night of October 15th. The witness, a long-haul trucker named Earl Robbins, had noticed the vehicles because the sedan was driving without headlights, maintaining a steady distance behind the van for several miles. Robbins was now retired and living in Arizona, but he agreed to speak with detectives over the phone. His memory of that night remained surprisingly clear, aided by the fact that he had reported the incident to police at the time, concerned about what appeared to be a case of aggressive driving or possible road rage. The van was keeping to the speed limit. Nothing unusual about how they were driving, Robbins explained, but that sedan behind them, it was like they were hunting something. When the van took the exit toward the mountains, the sedan followed. That's when I knew something wasn't right. The exit Robbins described led to a network of logging roads that wound deep into the Shasta Trinity National Forest, the same area where the van had eventually been discovered. For the first time since the investigation began, detectives had a possible timeline and route for the last hours of Rising Storm's lives. Castellanos and Morrison spent the next week driving those mountain roads, trying to reconstruct the path. That might have led 4 young musicians to their deaths. The terrain was challenging even in daylight, with narrow roads that twisted through dense forest, past abandoned logging camps and seasonal cabins that stood empty for months at a time. It was the kind of landscape where someone could disappear completely, where a vehicle could be hidden so thoroughly that it might never be found. They discovered several spots along the route where the road widened enough for one vehicle to force, another to stop, places where an ambush could be carried out without risk of witnesses. But it was at a remote intersection, nearly 40 miles from where the van was eventually found, that Morrison spotted something that changed the direction of their investigation, embedded in the bark of an old pine tree, barely visible beneath. 2 decades of growth was a fragment of metal that reflected sunlight when she moved her flashlight across its surface. Careful examination revealed it to be a piece of chrome bumper, consistent with the kind of decorative trim found on luxury sedans from the late 70s. The fragment was small, but it suggested that a collision had occurred at this location, possibly during a confrontation between Rising Storm's van and their pursuers. Crime scene technicians found additional evidence at the site, microscopic paint chips that could potentially be matched to a specific vehicle if it was ever located. Margaret Walsh had been following the investigation with a mixture of hope and dread, calling Detective Castellanos every few days for updates. The confirmation that her son and his bandmates had been murdered rather than killed in an accident brought a strange sense of relief. After 22 years of wondering, she finally knew that Danny hadn't died because of carelessness or bad luck. Someone had deliberately taken him from her, and now there was at least a possibility that person could be held accountable. I used to lie awake at night imagining that they'd just broken down somewhere, that they were waiting for help that never came, Margaret told Castellanos during one of their meetings. At least now I know that Danny fought. He wouldn't have gone quietly. The detective had developed a deep respect for Margaret Walsh during the course of the investigation. Her dedication to finding answers had never wavered, even when police resources had been diverted to newer cases, even when private investigators had stopped returning her calls. She had kept Danny's memory alive through sheer force of will, and now that persistence was finally yielding results. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Detective Morrison had been reviewing financial records from Redwood Studios, looking for any unusual transactions or payments that might provide a lead, when she discovered something that had been overlooked in the original investigation. On October 10, 1979, just 5 days before Rising Storm's disappearance, someone had paid cash for detailed information about the band's recording schedule and travel plans. The payment had been made to a studio employee named Rick Dalton, a sound engineer who had worked part-time at Redwood Studios for less than 6 months. According to employment records, Dalton had been fired just 1 week after Rising Storm's disappearance, officially for excessive absences and poor performance. But the timing suggested a more sinister connection. Tracking down Rick Dalton after 23 years proved to be a challenge. He had moved frequently since leaving California in 1979, working a series of short-term jobs in recording studios across the country. But Morrison's methodical research eventually led her to a small town in Nevada, where Dalton had been employed as a custodian at a community college for the past 5 years. Now, in his early 60s, Dalton was a thin, nervous man who seemed to age visibly when Morrison and Castellanos showed up at his workplace with their badges and questions about Rising Storm. He agreed to speak with them in private, but his hands shook as he lit one cigarette after another, and his eyes never quite met theirs directly. "I knew you'd come eventually," Dalton said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 23 years. The story he told them was one of desperation, bad decisions, and consequences that had spiraled far beyond anything he could have imagined. In 1979, Rick Dalton had been drowning in gambling debts, owing more than $15,000 to bookmakers who were becoming increasingly aggressive in their collection efforts. When a man approached him with an offer to pay $500 for information about Rising Storm's schedule, Dalton had seen it as an easy solution to his immediate problems. He said he was from a record company, that they wanted to make the band an offer, but needed to know when they'd be traveling, Dalton explained. It seemed harmless enough, just their departure time and which road they'd be taking home. "I never thought anyone would get hurt." The man who had approached Dalton was well-dressed and articulate, driving an expensive sedan, and carrying business cards from what appeared to be a legitimate music industry company. He had known enough about the recording business to convince Dalton that his interest in Rising Storm was professional rather than personal. Only later, after the band's disappearance made headlines Had Dalton begun to suspect that he had been manipulated? I tried to contact the police back then, Dalton continued, his voice growing even quieter. But I was scared they'd figure out what I'd done. I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew. Detective Castellanos leaned forward across the small table where they were conducting the interview. We need you to describe this man in as much detail as possible. Anything you remember about him, his appearance, his car, the way he spoke. Dalton closed his eyes as if trying to summon a memory he had spent decades trying to forget. He was maybe 40, average height, but well-built, like he worked out regularly. Dark hair, expensive suit, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged. In boardrooms, not recording studios, his car was a black Cadillac, late 70s model, with chrome details that caught the light. The description was vague but consistent with the evidence they had gathered. More importantly, Dalton remembered a detail that could prove crucial to identifying the man. During their conversation, the stranger had mentioned a previous connection to the music industry, specifically that he had once managed a band that had been screwed over by a record deal that fell through. He said something about how young musicians needed to be protected from people who would take advantage of them, Dalton recalled. At the time, I thought he was talking about record companies. Now, I think he was talking about himself. Armed with this new information, Morrison began researching music industry managers and agents who had been active in California during the late 70s. It was tedious work, involving hundreds of phone calls and record searches, but she was looking for someone who fit Dalton's description and had a history of failed business ventures or conflicts with record labels. The name that eventually emerged from this research was Leonard Lenny Carver, a former band manager who had operated in the San Francisco area during the 70s. Carver had managed several promising groups that had ultimately failed to achieve commercial success, often under circumstances that involved disputes over contracts and money. By 1979, his reputation in the industry had deteriorated to the point where few musicians would work with him. Carver had been 41 in 1979, matching Dalton's description, and drove a black 1978 Cadillac Eldorado that he had purchased with money borrowed against future commissions that never materialized. More significantly, he had a history of increasingly erratic behavior as his career collapsed, including several incidents where he had confronted former clients who he believed had betrayed him. But tracking down Leonard Carver in 2001 proved impossible for a simple reason. He had been dead for 18 years. According to records from the San Francisco Police Department, Carver had died in 1983 from a heart attack suffered during a confrontation with police officers who had been called to investigate reports of him threatening a music producer. He had died alone in his apartment, surrounded by boxes of contracts and photographs from his failed career. The revelation that their primary suspect was long dead might have ended a lesser investigation, but Castellanos refused to let the case close without exploring every possible connection. If Carver had been responsible for the murders, he might have had accomplices or associates who were still alive. The detective began researching everyone who had worked with Carver during the late 70s, looking for connections that might explain how Rising Storm had been targeted. This research led to Margaret Sullivan, Carver's former secretary, and the person who had handled most of his business correspondence during his final years in the music industry. Now retired and living in Sacramento, Sullivan agreed to meet with detectives at her home, a modest house filled with mementos from her decades of work in various entertainment industry offices. Lenny was brilliant when I first started working. For him, Sullivan explained, serving coffee to the detectives in her living room. He had an eye for talent and could negotiate deals that other managers couldn't even imagine. But something changed in him during the late 70s. He became obsessed with the idea that people were stealing from him, that every failure was someone else's fault. Sullivan described a man whose grip on reality had become increasingly tenuous as his career declined. Carver had begun keeping detailed files on musicians and industry professionals he considered enemies, plotting elaborate schemes to sabotage their careers or recover money he believed they owed him. By 1979, these plans had become the primary focus of his attention, consuming far more energy than his legitimate business activities. He started talking about teaching lessons to people who had crossed him, Sullivan recalled. At first, I thought he was just venting frustration, but then he began asking me to research specific bands and their recording schedules. He said he wanted to make them offers they couldn't refuse. The phrase sent a chill through Detective Morrison. It suggested that Rising Storm might not have been Carver's only target, that other young musicians might have been approached with similar offers that could have led to violence. Sullivan confirmed the suspicion when she mentioned that Carver had been particularly interested in bands that were on the verge of breakthrough success, groups that represented everything his own clients had failed to achieve. He talked about Rising Storm specifically, Sullivan continued, her voice growing quieter as she recalled details she had spent 2 decades trying to forget. He said they were exactly the kind of band that didn't deserve success, that they'd gotten opportunities that should have gone to more deserving musicians. According to Sullivan, Carver had spent weeks researching Rising Storm before their final recording session, learning everything he could about their background, their families, and their plans for the future. He had been particularly interested in the fact that they were carrying master recordings and contracts that could launch their careers, documents that Carver believed represented a kind of stolen success. The night before they were supposed to come home from the studio, Lenny told me he was going to collect what was owed, Sullivan said. I thought he meant money, but now I think he meant something much worse. Detective Castellanos asked Sullivan if she remembered any details about Carver's activities on October 15, 1979, the night Rising Storm disappeared. She recalled that he had left the office early that afternoon, claiming he had a business meeting that could change everything. He had been carrying a briefcase and wearing his most expensive suit, as if he were preparing for an important occasion. He seemed different that day, Sullivan explained, calmer than he'd been in months, like he'd finally found a solution to all his problems. He told me not to worry about anything, that by the next morning everything would be different. Carver had not returned to the office the following day or for the rest of that week. When Sullivan had finally contacted him at home, he had claimed to be sick with the flu, but she had heard something in his voice that suggested a deeper kind of distress. Within a month, he had closed the office permanently, telling Sullivan that he was retiring from the music business. The investigation had now established a clear motive and a prime suspect, but the fact that Leonard Carver had been dead for 18 years complicated any hope of achieving justice through traditional legal channels. However, Castellanos believed that solving the case could still provide the closure that the families desperately needed, and might prevent other crimes if Carver had indeed had accomplices. Sullivan provided detectives with boxes of Carver's old business records, including appointment books and client files that might contain additional clues about his activities in October 1979. Most of the documents had been stored in her garage for more than 20 years, yellowed with age but still legible enough to provide insights into Carver's state of mind during the period leading up to the murders. Among these papers, Morrison discovered a hand-drawn map of the mountain roads between Eureka and Rising Storm's hometown, with specific locations marked in red ink. The markings corresponded to isolated areas where one vehicle could force another to stop, including the intersection where they had found the metal fragment embedded in the pine tree. This map provided the clearest evidence yet that the murders had been carefully planned, rather than the result of a chance encounter. More disturbing was a letter Carver had apparently written but never sent, addressed to Vincent Hardwick at Redwood Studios. In the letter, Carver outlined his belief that the music industry was controlled by people who deliberately prevented talented musicians from achieving success, keeping the best opportunities for themselves and their favorites. He specifically mentioned Rising Storm as an example of undeserving musicians who were about to receive success that should have gone to more qualified bands. These boys think they can just walk into a studio and emerge with everything I've worked my entire career to achieve, Carver had written in his distinctive handwriting. They have no idea what real sacrifice looks like, what it means to dedicate your life to music only to watch lesser talents get handed the opportunities you deserve. But they're going to learn. The letter was dated October 12, 1979, just 3 days before Rising Storm's disappearance, and represented clear evidence of premeditation. Combined with Rick Dalton's testimony about providing information to Carver and Margaret Sullivan's recollections of his behavior during that period, the case against the former music manager was now overwhelming. Detective Castellanos arranged a meeting with all 4 families to present the findings of the investigation. Margaret Walsh brought her husband Robert, who had remained supportive throughout her 22-year quest for answers, despite his own skepticism about ever learning the truth. Marcus Rivera's parents attended along with his sister, who had been only 12 when her brother disappeared, but had never stopped wondering what had happened to him. Tony Brennan's family was represented by his brother Michael, who had taken over the family's auto repair business and had spent decades wondering if he should have insisted on going with the band that night. Jimmy Chen's parents had both passed away in the intervening years, but his sister Sarah, the hiker who had first spotted the van, was there to hear the truth about her brother's fate. The conference room at the sheriff's station felt too small to contain the weight of 22 years of grief and unanswered questions. Castellanos had prepared a detailed presentation, but he began simply acknowledging the pain that these families had carried for more than 2 decades and expressing his admiration for their persistence in seeking the truth. "Your sons were murdered by a man named Leonard Carver," Castellanos said, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of the moment. Carver was a failed music manager who had become obsessed with the idea that successful young musicians were stealing opportunities that rightfully belonged to others. He specifically targeted Rising Storm because they represented everything he had failed to achieve in his own career. The detective outlined the evidence that had led to this conclusion, from Rick Dalton's confession about selling information to the map found among Carver's papers that showed he had planned the ambush in detail. He explained how Carver had likely followed the van into the mountains, forced them to stop at the isolated intersection, and then attacked them when they refused to surrender their master recordings and contracts. "Your sons fought back," Castellanos continued, noting the defensives, wounds found on their remains. "They didn't give up their dreams without a struggle. But they were outnumbered, and Carver was prepared for violence in ways they never could have anticipated." Margaret Walsh sat quietly throughout the presentation, tears streaming down her face, but her expression one of relief rather than despair. After 22 years of wondering, she finally knew what had happened to Danny. He hadn't died because of anything he had done wrong, or because of some random accident that could have been prevented. He had died because he was talented and hopeful, because someone else's twisted worldview had transformed those positive qualities into targets for violence. "What happened to Carver?" asked Michael Brennan, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Did he ever pay for what he did?" Castellanos explained that Carver had died in 1983, but that his final years appeared to have been consumed by paranoia and declining mental health. According to police reports from San Francisco, he had become increasingly isolated and erratic, confronting former clients and industry contacts with rambling accusations about conspiracies and stolen opportunities. His death during a confrontation with police suggested that his grip on reality had deteriorated completely. "In a way, he did pay," Castellanos said. He spent the last 4 years of his life consumed by the same anger and resentment that led him to kill your sons. That's not justice in the legal sense, but it's a kind of consequence. Sarah Chen asked about the missing instruments and master recordings, wondering if they had ever been recovered. Castellanos explained that they had likely been destroyed by Carver, who would have seen them as symbols of everything he resented about the music industry. The briefcase Danny had been carrying, along with all the contracts and recordings it contained, had vanished completely, representing not just the loss of 4 young lives, but the destruction of their dreams and potential. The families spent another hour discussing the investigation and its implications, sharing memories of their sons and the impact their deaths had had on their lives. For the first time in 22 years, they were able to talk about the tragedy with complete knowledge of what had happened, free from the endless speculation and self-doubt that had characterized their previous conversations. Margaret Walsh approached Detective Castellanos as the meeting was ending, shaking his hand with a firmness that surprised him. "Thank you for not giving up," she said simply. "Thank you for caring enough to find the truth." The detective had solved dozens of cases during his career, but none had affected him as deeply as the Rising Storm investigation. Perhaps it was because he had been there at the beginning, a young officer searching the highways for any trace of 4 missing musicians. Or perhaps it was because the victims had been so young, so close to achieving the dreams that had motivated everything they did. Whatever the reason, bringing closure to their families felt like the most important work he had ever done. The case officially closed 6 weeks later, when the district attorney's office announced that Leonard Carver would have been charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder if he had still been alive. The announcement received significant media attention, both because of the length of time that had passed since the murders and because of the unusual motive that had driven them. Margaret Walsh used the media attention to establish a foundation in Danny's memory, providing scholarships for young musicians who might not otherwise be able to afford recording studio time or professional instruction. The foundation's first beneficiary was a teenage guitarist from Danny's hometown, a young woman whose talent reminded Margaret of her son at the same age. Danny would have wanted his story to help other musicians, not discourage them, Margaret explained to a reporter covering the foundation's launch. He believed that music could change the world, and maybe now his memory can help make sure that other young people get the chances he never had. The families also worked together to create a memorial at the site where the van had been discovered, a simple granite marker that listed the names of the 4 young men and the dates of their birth and death. The memorial was placed near the hiking trail that Sarah Chen and her partner had been following when they made their discovery, ensuring that future visitors to the area would remember the dreams that had died in that remote ravine. Vincent Hardwick attended the memorial dedication ceremony, bringing with him copies of the master recordings from Rising Storm's final session. For the first time in 23 years, Highway Dreams and the other songs the band had recorded were played publicly, their voices echoing through the forest where their lives had ended. The music was everything the families remembered, full of energy and optimism and the kind of raw talent that suggested genuine potential for success. Listening to Danny's guitar solos and Jimmy's vocals, it was impossible not to wonder what kind of music they might have created if they had been allowed to continue developing their skills and exploring their creativity. Margaret Walsh stood quietly during the ceremony, her hand resting on the granite memorial as her son's music played through speakers that seemed incongruously modern in the wilderness setting. She had spent 22 years wondering about Danny's final moments, imagining scenarios that ranged from tragic accidents to elaborate kidnapping schemes. Now she knew the truth, and while it was more violent and senseless than anything she had imagined, it was also somehow easier to bear than the uncertainty that had preceded it. Detective Castellanos attended the ceremony as well, along with Detective Morrison and several other officers who had worked on the investigation. For all of them, the case had become more than just another assignment, a reminder of why they had chosen careers in law enforcement and what they hoped to accomplish through their work. As the ceremony concluded and the families began to make their way back down the hiking trail, Castellanos lingered near the memorial thinking about the investigation that had consumed the past 6 months of his professional life. The case had been solved, the truth had been revealed, and the families had finally received the closure they had sought for more than 2 decades. But the detective knew that some wounds never completely heal, that Margaret Walsh and the other families would carry their grief for the rest of their lives, even though they now understood what had caused it. Still, there was satisfaction in knowing that Leonard Carver's crime had finally been exposed, that 4 young men who had been forgotten by everyone except their families were now remembered for their talent and potential rather than simply for the mystery of their disappearance. Their music would outlive their killer, their dreams would inspire the scholarship recipients who followed in their footsteps, and their story would serve as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through patience and determination. Margaret Walsh returned to her home that evening with a sense of peace she had not experienced since October 1979. Danny's bedroom remained exactly as he had left it, his guitar propped against the wall and his notebook of song, lyrics open on the desk. But now, instead of representing an ongoing mystery, these artifacts felt like a celebration of a life that had been cut short, but had still managed to create something beautiful and lasting. She sat at Danny's desk and opened the notebook to the last entry he had made, a rough draft of lyrics for a song he had been planning to propose to the band when they returned from the recording session. The words spoke of highways and dreams, of young people setting out to change the world through the power of their music. It was the song he would never get to finish, the dream he would never get to pursue. But it was also evidence of the hope and ambition that had defined his short life. Outside her window, Margaret could see the lights of the town where Danny had grown up, where he had learned to play guitar, and where he had formed Rising Storm with 3 friends who shared his passion for music. The town had changed significantly in the 23 years since the band's disappearance, but it still contained the venues where they had played their first concerts and the homes where they had rehearsed their songs and planned their futures. Tomorrow, Margaret would begin the work of administering the Scholarship Foundation, reviewing applications from young musicians who needed financial assistance to pursue their dreams. It was work that would keep Danny's memory alive while helping to ensure that other talented young people would not be denied opportunities because of economic circumstances. In a way, it represented the completion of something Danny had started, a continuation of his belief that music could make a positive difference in the world. The Rising Storm case would remain in Detective Castellanos' files as one of the most challenging and rewarding investigations of his career, a reminder that persistence and methodical police work could sometimes overcome even the most difficult circumstances. The 4 young men who had vanished in 1979 were finally at rest. Their families finally had answers, and their killer's identity was finally known. It was not the kind of ending that anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending nonetheless. And after 22 years of uncertainty, that was more than anyone had dared to hope for.